The EU could die, says France's President Macron. The EU, a political and economic union of 27 countries, like one big happy family. Right? They get together and decide policies on things like security and whether the lid on your plastic bottle should remain attached or not. And just like a family, the EU often struggles to actually agree on anything these days. For example, the EU has a common currency, the euro, but that is used by 20 out of 27 countries. There's also a big waiting list for countries who wish to join the EU, but countries inside the EU can't actually agree on who should join and who shouldn't. And now this, France's president saying the EU could just simply die. Okay, dramatic. He's referring to an existential threat to the Union, not a physical one just yet. He claimed that the bloc is falling behind US and China because of over-regulation and under-investment. In simple terms, lots of talking, not a lot of action, or as the singer Elvis Presley said, a little less conversation, a little more action please. An example of this would be the EU support for Ukraine. The EU stands proud and says we will support Ukraine in its war against Russia. But it often takes months and months to agree on the right military packages and how much should be spent. In the meantime, while EU leaders sit at the table talking about what should be done, Russia continues to strike Ukraine. There is not much time for bureaucracy during war. But Macron is not the first world leader of a European country to suggest that the EU is in danger. No, Viktor Orban, the leader of Hungary, has also made a similar statement, suggesting that the world could become Asian-led rather than Western-led in the next few decades. Orban's reasons for EU decline were different to Macron's though. For Orban, the downfall would be because of ideological purposes. He simply wagged his finger and implied that the EU was just too woke. Macron doesn't think that the world will be Asian-led necessarily. He thinks it could be led by China, a powerful rival, or it could become led by the USA. Either way, Macron's not worried about who leads the world. He's just scared that it won't be the EU. Speaking at the Berlin Global Dialogue event, Macron said that the EU could die, and here was a further elaboration of his statement. He said, "We are on a verge of a very important moment. Our former model is over. We are over-regulating and under-investing." He then added that if they didn't get their act together in a few years, it would be game over. It is an interesting pattern with Macron. This is not the first time that he has said this. In fact, in April, he called for more integrated European defense. He warned that the EU could become a vassal state to the US in terms of military and security. Indeed, it is the US that backs the most money into Ukraine's war against Russia, despite Russia's threat being an existential one to Europe rather than the USA. Macron is not the only one calling for a potential EU army though. The former Prime Minister of Italy also said in a report that the EU should spend big on joint defence projects because they could no longer rely on the US. That was in part due to Donald Trump's comments, a potential US president who has said he would not continue backing Ukraine if he won the presidency in November. I digress though. Back to the bureaucracy, and not all countries in the 27-member family agree with France. Two of the biggest economic powers in the EU are France and Germany, and like a rather dysfunctional family, the mum and dad don't get on very well. Germany is much warmer on China, for example. It wants to invest more in China. And as I make this video, it was due to vote against new EU duties on Chinese electric vehicles. Although it is worth pointing out that German car makers made a third of their sales in China last year. France is basically saying, look what happened a few years ago when we became too cozy with Russia. We relied on their gas, and then when Russia went to war with Ukraine, it was difficult to leverage sanctions against Russia because Russia just said, we'll take your gas away. But Germany is saying that too much regulation and restriction of this stuff could lead to the EU's harm. For the time being, dialogue is good, and the end is not inevitable. It is good that they are having active conversations and looking to avoid the EU death. But be warned, too much conversation and not enough action could indeed turn the tide. Macron is always a little bit dramatic though. In 2019, he described NATO as brain dead and expressed concern that NATO was not committed to collective defence. But since then, NATO has beefed up defence spending, and 2 new countries have joined, Finland and Sweden. And so it seems, with the right convincing, more action and less conversation is indeed possible.